Good afternoon. I am Michael Popa, Executive Director of the Mainstream Coalition. And on behalf of our team, thank you for joining us for Mainstream Live, a series of conversations with figures in Kansas politics, advocacy, and community building. For over 25 years, Mainstream Coalition has been advocating for common sense government and healthy communities in Kansas. You can learn more about Mainstream and our body of work at mainstreamcoalition.org. And while you're there, please consider joining. Each membership contribution goes a long way in supporting our voter education and engagement efforts in the upcoming elections. And now, I would like to introduce my guest, Reverend Rick Behrens, Senior Minister at Grandview Park Presbyterian Church. Hi, Reverend Behrens. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Of course, it's our pleasure. So could you tell us a little bit more about Grandview Park?
Well, Grandview Park, as I want to say, is neither in Grandview nor in a park. It is in the Prescott neighborhood in Kansas City, Kansas, which is part of the Central Avenue neighborhood in Kansas City, Kansas. We're just a block south of Central Avenue and a block east of 18th Street. We've been around for 130 years at this location. We've always been a neighborhood church. We don't have any off-street parking, so we are very much part of the neighborhood. We just sit in among the houses and we try to make connections.
Excellent. So I was reading a little bit about the church, and the mission of Grandview Park is to serve as a community of faith, spiritually connected to the community around us, reflecting the diversity of neighborhood in a church that is full. And so how have you and the church transformed that statement into action?
Well, we wrote that statement. I've been at the church since 1982. Seen a lot of change over the years. I think I was 5 years old when I was hired at the church. That's a joke, Mike. Sorry.
Good joke.
There's been a lot of change, and we actually wrote that mission vision statement, because it's a little bit of both, around 1996. And that was at a time when our neighborhood, the whole Central Avenue neighborhood, was undergoing a dramatic demographic shift. Up until the early 90s, there were maybe 3 to 5% of a Latino population in the Central Avenue area. And in a span of about 10 years, from 95 to 2005, it went from 3 to 5% to 65%. So we realized that we had to change, and that vision mission statement was part of that realization. And so we began to think about how to put legs and hands and feet to that statement. And one of the first things we did, not really the first thing, but maybe the most significant thing that we did was in 2002, we decided we were going to do worship bilingually. Both languages together in one room, no headsets or anything, just worshiping together, being together, sharing culture and language. And so we started that in 2002, and we've been doing it ever since. We didn't really have any models to build on, because most churches, when they start a ministry with a different culture language group, they nest them in a different part of the building at a different time of day. But we didn't believe that was what was needed in our neighborhood and in our community. So we decided we were going to worship together in one space, get to know each other. Each of us get to know our different cultures and languages together. And that's what we've been doing now for 18 years. We were kind of on the forefront of that in terms of the institutions in our community. Most of the institutions in our community were pretty slow to adopt bilingual efforts. But we've been doing it, for 18 years. And I think every Sunday is an experiment, really, in how we get it done. So
how does that work logistically? Do you do a part in English and then a part in Spanish, or?
Yeah, most everything in the worship service that's liturgy or message is fully translated back and forth. We've discovered that people don't really tolerate bilingual experiences unless it's in little bites. So for instance, when I write a sermon, I line it out one sentence at a time. And that's the way Carmen, who is our lay pastor from Ecuador, she and I work together. She interprets and we go back and forth. It's more like a conversation than if you did a paragraph. You know, people then check out and they start making their grocery list or whatever while you're preaching if you go too long in one language. So best thing to do is to try to swing it back and forth. So that's what we do.
It's interesting. So can we stay on faith and religion for a minute?
Sure.
Excellent. So it's said, and I believe, that Jesus was an activist and an educator on the tenets of social justice. Have you heard that before? Or what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, Michael, I'm a firm believer in that interpretation of Jesus and who he was. You know, just after he comes out of his wilderness wilderness temptation, he ends up in the synagogue and in Nazareth, and he picks up the scroll of Isaiah and reads from chapter 61, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to set the prisoners free, to give sight to the blind, and to liberate the oppressed." And he says, that time is now. It's not later, it's right now. And so that's a significant passage that tells me a lot about what Jesus was about, in addition to reading the Gospels and seeing what he does. But then you also have Matthew 25, the story of the judgment of the nations, where Jesus speaks to he separates the sheep from the goats. He says, this is how the nations are going to be separated. Those who take care of the least of these, you're part of my family and I love you and come into my home. Those who don't take care of the least of these, the stranger, the orphan, the widow, the prisoner, you're going to go someplace else. We're just not going to welcome you into my house. So I think that's instructive. Our denomination just started in the last year, Matthew 25 initiative, the Presbyterian Church USA. We have this initiative that has congregations can sign up for the initiative, and there are 3 parts to it. You can choose any one of the 3 or do all 3. And we at Grandview Park have chosen to do all 3 because we're already doing all 3, which first part is to dismantle structural racism. Second part is to eradicate systemic poverty. And the third part is to build congregational vitality. And we interpret that as not only congregational vitality, but community vitality, because we know as a congregation that we aren't going to be vital if our community around us isn't vital. So we see those two as really tied together. So yeah, Jesus did all that, called us to do all that. And it's all about building community together and building some kind of a beloved community with all people welcome, regardless of race, sexual orientation, religion. All people are welcome in Jesus' beloved community and in the community we're trying to build. So.
Great. And I think some people may have a hard time wrapping their heads around a social justice mission, social justice church. So would you say like the main role of a faith community in advocating for social justice is to create that community?
Yeah, I think it's to build the relationships, to connect people up, to build power in a community, to determine its own destiny, to take care of those who are in need. But that only happens if you work hard at building relationships, one-to-one, organization with organization. There has to be a beautiful tapestry woven together in the community, and that's, I think, one of our problems right now is the tapestry is frayed from years of neglect, from years of not just neglect, but outright attempts by people in power to rip it apart. And so we've got to pull those threads back together and really reweave that tapestry of community. And that takes time and a lot of creative effort.
Well, speaking of community and weaving that tapestry, faith and religious beliefs are diverse and they're intensely personal. So as a Presbyterian congregation and ministry, how do you reach out to minister to people in other denominations or other religions?
Well, for us here at Grandview Park, largely that happens through our involvement with organizations like More Squared and AIR, Advocates for Immigrant Rights and Reconciliation. More Squared is Metro Organization for Racial and Economic Equity. Both those groups, one of which we started, AIR, started in the basement of this church in 2006. Started out under a couple different names, but has evolved to be AIR. AIR has in it multiple denominations, and in order to do the work that we do with immigrants and refugees, it would be ridiculous if we weren't working cross-faith, cross-denomination. So we recognize that's absolutely essential to the work we do. And then with More Squared is also a multi-faith, multi-denomination organization. Both are faith-based organizations. So, and recognize that in order to accomplish this transformative work, we have to reach across every barrier out there and try to pull people together around a goal of the common good.
Well, it sounds like you stay pretty busy then. You just mentioned AIR and More Squared, and you not only pastor Grandview Park, you are a staunch advocate in social justice. You serve on the Mainstream Board of Directors. You actually serve on the More Squared Board of Directors as co-chair, and you're heavily involved with the Safe and Welcoming Wyandotte movement. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about More Squared, and if you could tell us more about the mission and how you became involved there.
Well, the mission of More Squared really is that we are all called to break down the barriers of race and economics that separate us by race and class. More Squared is not a service organization. We don't provide services or programs, but instead More Squared works to change systems, to change policies. And it does that by organizing people and organizing money and bringing them together. It's a large part of the work of More Squared is training people to understand their self-interest, training people in how to claim power and to use it as a community. So I'm really thrilled to be part of More Squared. My co-chair is Minister Kiku Brooks from Oasis Church, and I'm proud to work alongside her. I got involved with More Squared. I was around when they first organized back, I think it was 2004, and was invited in, but at that point we were at the beginning stages of a lot of advocacy around immigration. And at that point, that didn't seem to be really a core piece of what More Squared was going to be working on. But over the years, I've seen that immigration has become more important, and More Squared as actually vitally important. And as far as More Squared is connected to a national network of faith-based organizations called the Gamaliel Foundation. And Gamaliel, really one of their central pieces of work is around immigration and justice for immigrants. So I began to see that about 6-7 years ago, and Laura McDonald, who's our executive director, came and sat down and did a one-to-one with me here in my office, and was very clear to me that if the immigration issues aren't on the table at More Squared, then she didn't want to be there either. So, and she saw our congregation as a key to opening up that discussion more with More Squared.
Great. So, well, speaking of immigration, Safe and Welcoming Wyandotte, which you are a part of, is a coalition of advocacy organizations representing some diverse communities in the Metro and beyond. Included among those organizations is More Squared, Mainstream Coalition, ACLU of Kansas, and League of Women Voters. Could you tell us a little bit more about that coalition, maybe how it formed, how it came about, and the work that it does?
Yeah, I think there's over 30 organizations that are part of the coalition and have signed on to try to get Safe and Welcoming passed. It really started in the aftermath of the 2016 election. Lots of us were really concerned about the statements that had been made by the president-elect at that point about who he was going to come after. And so we realized that we needed to do something and organize. So a large group met at the Hispanic Development Fund and began to think about how we could put something like this together. So the effort really began November, December of 2016. And we spent about a year crafting, six months to a year crafting the ordinance and developing it. And then we've spent the last 3 years really just trying to educate people, get them to understand what it's about, and share it and get it passed. It's been very frustrating that people have been particularly in the unified government in Wyandotte County, have been resistant to even wanting to hear about it. And yet we've got tremendous community support. We've flooded commissioners with postcards of support. We've done all kinds of listening sessions to get them to understand. And just last month, there was a special session of the Board of Commissioners to talk about Safe and Welcoming. And it was far less than satisfying for those of us who were listening. There were 150 people who had signed on to that special session, and many of whom who were hoping to be able to offer comment. Absolutely no immigrants were offered the opportunity to speak during comment on that. Most of the time was taken up by the legal department of the unified government, explaining the police and sheriff's position as to why it couldn't be done. So we are taking apart that PowerPoint piece by piece, fact checking it, going to get it back to all the commissioners so that they recognize that this was the fix was in on their presentation. It was totally one-sided. And we also have a group of 3 commissioners who are for the ordinance and who are working with us to make sure it gets back on the table and gets passed.
Great. And you don't have to comment on this, but I was listening in and I was watching that special hearing, and it seemed pretty choreographed on the city side.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
It felt like there were delay tactics going on to keep the community from having time to speak, and that was very frustrating. In addition to the fact that the legal department hadn't bothered to find any of the positives about it, but only shared negatives.
Right, and I think only 3 people out of the 150 were able to speak very briefly at that.
Yeah, that's true.
So the racism has reared its ugly head again. Not only in communities where we're advocating for safe and welcoming, but also recently just reminded of the systemic racism plaguing our communities by George Floyd and the others who have been murdered. What ways are the organizations that you're involved with supporting our communities of color and standing up for racial justice, specifically to that?
Well, that's been at the heart of the work of More Squared all along. It's been at the heart of the mission of More Squared and also the heart of the mission of AIR. The More Squared really has been part of nearly every clergy faith-based protest that's happened, particularly in KCK, but also most of them in Kansas City, Missouri, where there's been organizing behind the scenes for those efforts. In KCK, the effort has been ongoing. A year ago, well, 2 years ago, we were part of the effort to get Lamont McIntyre exonerated and freed from prison after spending 20 years for a double homicide that he did not have anything to do with. That detective, we have called for for an investigation into his behavior, not only on that case, but in dealing with many people of color, particularly young Black women whom he coerced, abused, treated horribly. And we may not even have an inkling of how horrible his treatment of them were. There's 15 uninvestigated murders of young Black women in Kansas City, Kansas, that the police department chose not to investigate. 15 over the last 25 years. It's hard to imagine this, but the corruption is deep, and we have been working on that in KCK for a long time now. And we did have a win last year when we asked for the police chief's firing, and within a month he resigned. That was Chief Ziegler, who happened to be a partner of Roger Golubski back in the day when a lot of this was going on. Since then, we've asked for three things of the unified government of Wyandotte County, and one is to establish a bilingual hotline where people can report abuse, not to the police department, but to an independent hotline where they can feel safe to report abuse. We've asked for a community-driven process for the selection of the next police chief, and we have demanded that there's an investigation of Roger Golubski and all that he was involved in. And fortunately, DA Mark Dupree is in line with these demands and is actually putting some things in place that will hopefully move forward these demands. So we really appreciate District Attorney Dupree's efforts, his willingness to turn over the rocks that nobody else wants to turn over in our community to make things better.
Excellent. And you mentioned previously, we were talking about the different organizations that you were involved in, and you had mentioned AIR again. That started in Grandview Park basement. Was that initially a ministry of your church?
Yeah. So I had the good fortune of getting a sabbatical grant from the Lilly Foundation in 2006. And I got to spend a week at Iona, this really beautiful Western Isle off the coast of Scotland. And at Iona, they challenge you what you're going to do when you come back to your regular life. And one of the things that was happening when I was there on that sabbatical was that I was getting emails from our Latino members and members of the community who were largely undocumented, saying that they were afraid to go out of their house. They were afraid to do anything. I don't know if you remember, 2006 was when the Sensenbrenner bill was out there, which, gosh, we looked at it as a horrible thing then, but it's really sort of mild Trumpism right now regarding immigration. And there were reports that immigration customs was at every grocery store in the neighborhood. So people were living in fear, and the faith community wasn't speaking out about this at all that I could see, not locally here in the KC metro area. So I made the decision when I was at Iona that I was going to come back and I was going to try to gather some clergy just here in KCK and see if we could begin to do some things. And so, yeah, there were a few of the Catholic priests from the community and a variety of other pastors. We sat down and we started talking. We originally called ourselves People of Faith for Hospitality and Justice, but we recognized that was a really horrible acronym. So then, yeah,
okay,
try it. So then we became IJAM, and IJAM still exists, but we branched off from IJAM. IJAM was Immigrant Justice Advocacy Movement, and that still exists. we branched off and became AIR, Advocates for Immigrant Rights and Reconciliation. We have a lot of good relationships with different faith groups, and what we do with AIR is, of course, we advocate for comprehensive immigration reform. We do know your rights trainings, both with people who are being targeted by this administration and also with allies. We also do immigration 101s with churches or other organizations who want to better understand what the issues are and how to have an impact in their congregations. And then a variety of other things. We have two great organizers on board, Trinidad Raj Molina and Nubia Estefez are two great organizers who are out there in the field doing the work. We do have every fourth Monday a meeting, a general meeting for people to come and get involved in the meeting. Of course, we're doing it all via Zoom right now. There's a meeting coming up next Monday, the 22nd, I believe it is, for our AIR general meeting. If people would like to get involved, you could just send an email to info@air.org or airkc.org, or go to the Facebook page for AIR. You can find out all the information there.
Great, and we'll get that into the Facebook chat.
Great.
As well. And then how can people get involved with the other organizations that you're representing today? More Squared, Mainstream Coalition. Just kidding.
More Squared, there are several avenues in. We have clergy or faith leader caucuses that happen both on the Kansas side and the Missouri side. If anybody wanted, that's one of our primary goals, is to try to organize faith communities and bring them into the fold. So if anybody knows a pastor or is part of a church that would like to investigate, find out more about More Squared, you could email me, or you could email Marcus, is our Kansas organizer, Marcus Wynn, and his email is marcus@more2.org. Could email him and we could get some one-to-ones going on, get people to know what's going on with it. And there's also on the Kansas side, there's an Issues to Action meeting, which we had last night. So it's every third Monday, and people are invited to come to that and get involved in the different task force. That's for the Kansas side. There's a separate issues night for the Missouri side, which happens on the second Monday of every month. So there's plenty of ways to get involved, and if somebody were to just drop us a line, we'd make sure we got them plugged in.
Great. So before we leave, is there one thing that you'd like to impart on us today or leave us with?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, Michael, for chatting with me. It's been fun, and I appreciate the opportunity. I think we're at an inflection point, I think, for all of us, where we have before us some new possibilities to create a beloved community. Micah 6:8 is one of my favorite passages, and I think many people love it. It says, what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I believe that it's time for each of us to be part of the solution, to uproot systematic racism, to dismantle white supremacy. And it needs to happen now, just like Jesus said, the kingdom is now, it's not later, or the kingdom, as we like to say now, is now. It's not for some far off distant future. So I would just encourage us all to do what we can every day and in every way to build the beloved community that we all so desire and want.
Some powerful words, and I know that you get behind those and you show action on them. So thank you so much for all the work that you do. It's more important now than it ever has been, and appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today.
Thank you, Michael. I love being part of the mainstream board as well. So thank you for.
Well, we love having you. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks. And thanks to everyone for tuning in today. Please visit mainstreamcoalition.org to learn more about how you can make an impact in this year's elections. And in addition to a financial contribution, please consider participating in our foundation's Voter to Voter project. It's an innovative and effective peer-to-peer get out the vote effort in Kansas. Learn more and do more than vote at votertovoter.org. And make sure to join us this Thursday at 4:30 p.m. for Mainstream Live, continuing the conversation. A new series of discussions on diversity, equity, and inclusion. This week, we'll hear from Justice Horn, LaRon Thompson, and Rachel Russell, and we'll discuss, among other things, how white allies can best support our friends of color. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Mainstream Live.